Okay, we've talked about what firewalls do in general. Let's see implementations. We have something called a demilitarized zone, and that is taken from the idea that, you know, how like North and South Korea right now have sort of an area between their two borders called the DMZ. So the demilitarized zone, which is a semi-public network that is not fully trusted, it's not totally internal, it's not totally external. We also have a variant on that called a perimeter network, and we have a concept called a multi-homed device. Servers, sometimes you have a server in your own organization that you make accessible to the public, to the internet. Like maybe you are hosting a web server. You're not hosting it on some third-party service, but you're maintaining your own web server, or your own VPN server, or your own email server, or your own DNS server, or whatever. Sometimes you have servers that are exposed to the public network. Now, usually they're hiding behind a firewall, but they're still nonetheless exposed to the public network. And we allow people in the general public, in the internet, to actually come through and make a connection because, hey, it's the web server and they need to see your website. There are sort of general terms that are used to sometimes refer to these publicly accessible servers. One is a screened host, and that's basically some server or computer that's hiding behind a firewall. Another is a bastion host, and that's basically anything that is connected to the public network. So if you see these terms, you'll know they basically refer to servers or computers that are exposed to the public and on purpose. So here's a diagram of a typical demilitarized zone, DMZ, and I have the internal company LAN over here with various computers, and I have two firewalls. I'll have an external firewall connected to the internet and an internal firewall connected to the LAN. Now this is a small little network right here that probably has one or two bastion hosts in it, like a web server and maybe a public DNS server and maybe a VPN server, maybe, although some VPN servers are completely outside. And out in the internet, the addresses are completely public. In the internal network, they are almost certainly private. And then in the DMZ, they could be public or private, and that totally depends on how you implement your DMZ. I think frequently these days they are private, but they could still be public. I've seen implementations of both. So here's a DMZ, two firewalls, external and internal. And people on the internet, if they want to hack into the LAN, have to get past both. And from an IS auditor's perspective, we prefer to make the two firewalls be two different products, because if you can break past one, you don't just automatically break past the other. You have to have two different types of approaches. Here is a variant called a perimeter network, sometimes called a screened subnet. It's basically one firewall, but instead of, notice in the previous thing where one firewall just has two connections, in the screened subnet or the perimeter network, one firewall has three connections or four connections. And one of the connections goes to the internet, one goes to the LAN, and then one goes to the DMZ, the perimeter network, the screened subnet. When we use the term DMZ, we tend to think of a two firewall implementation. And when we talk about perimeter network, we tend to think of a third interface coming off of that same firewall. Obviously, in a perimeter network screen subnet kind of situation, you have a single firewall, which can be a single point of failure or a single security risk. But this is also a very common implementation as well. And the perimeter network can have public addresses or private, most likely private addresses. And the web server or whatever bastion host is on there, whatever screened host is on there, is something that the public wants to get to. It's the company website. So we have two implementations of our firewall, DMZ and perimeter. For maintaining your firewall, you need to generally review the logs. You need to start out by using the vendor's best practices for configuring and locking down firewalls. Firewalls by default are locked down, but you still, they still have default passwords, which you need to change. And they still have to be set up. So make sure that you have you review the logs, you patch it if there is a need to patch it. Vendors will occasionally put out patches for their products. And that you review the rule sets. Make sure that the firewall rules have not been changed inappropriately, which means, of course, you have to document what is appropriate. So here is a typical network kind of all put together. This is actually a rather simple diagram in terms of a larger network. Notice that I have the internal local area network here, the LAN, and I've got maybe a VoIP phone here with, and they're probably on their own switch or their own VLAN. I might have a PBX and a regular phone system as well. I'm in the middle of moving everything from the PBX down to VoIP. I'll have perhaps a VPN server with its own little protection. Most VPN servers have sort of their own little firewall on their interface, but it bypasses the firewalls, and people out on the internet tunnel to the VPN server and they get into the LAN that way. I'll have a DMZ or a screen subnet or something with possibly publicly accessible servers here, and people on the internet are coming in to connect to it. But the people on the internet are never going past this point. They're never going past the internal firewall, at least we hope not. So putting together the things we've been talking about, a sort of a typical network scenario. Next thing we're going to talk about is taking network protection a little farther with something called NAP, or Network Access Protection.